All right, thanks, Allie. I appreciate the time. Let's see. All right, well, thanks everyone for having me. I'm gonna speak a little bit about the watch to warning gap testbed. This testbed occurred last spring into the early summer, so 2021, with the final report being produced later on that summer. So we'll go through some of the findings here. So the testbed originated as part of a Central Region LEAD project. So this was tasked to a subgroup of that LEAD class, and they developed some recommendations that this testbed was tasked to explore, and it was mainly focused on that information gap between the watch issuance and then the beginning issuances of warnings. So they found that there was an information gap that tended to exist between those two product issuances, and how can we best improve our communication within that time frame. So they envisioned offices providing partners with actionable information, but that was it was very important that information was based in a sound foundation of mesoanalysis, and we'll talk about that a little bit more detail here in upcoming slides. But the group consulted a variety of subject matter experts to come up with these recommendations, and then finally produce those recommendations to this testbed team. So these were the participating offices. They were physically located in Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri, and these were chosen primarily to gather events from the early to mid-spring, mid-severe weather season, in anticipation that the team could then turn around and produce the final report by the end of convective season and before the beginning of the next fiscal year. Now, of course, with spinning up a testbed, we run the risk of severe weather not cooperating, and indeed that did happen with this testbed, with a record low number of events that occurred during this time period. But we did get some useful information out of this that we'll share. So that Central Region LEAD had a group of 7 recommendations that they would like to explore. And then this testbed focused on these 4 in particular, mainly from the aspect of the other 3 were at least in part being addressed by other groups, particularly within the Sioux community. So this testbed focused primarily on the communication aspect of these recommendations. And you can see here those 4 were basically improving a continuous flow of information from the WFO. The WFO taking on the role more of an educator during these events, so educating the public on what to expect during the event, expanded social media presence, and then viewing SPC more as a resource during these events. And then this team ultimately distilled that down into this one actionable objective, which was to improve the communication of actionable information in advance of severe thunderstorm development and or their arrival, then downstream of existing warnings and the end of the threat for a given area. So it's ultimately just to continuously improve that flow of information throughout the event. So what exactly does that look like? Well, say you were given this chart and the x-axis is time, but you've got your list of counties there on the left-hand side. And as we go through the event, you'll ultimately do a sit rep or a webinar, and then the watch comes out early on in the event. And all your counties receive that information all at once. Well, then your western extent, assuming your storms are moving from west to east, your western counties will ultimately get information early on in the event as those storms are moving through. And then your easternmost counties may not get relevant information pertaining to them until much later in the convective event. So you've got this large gap in time where there's potential that little to no information is being communicated to those farther eastern counties. And what the watch to warning gap communication method portrays is you'll have periodic times where you will communicate information that is important to those downstream counties at intervals within that gap time span. So, you know, maybe you pick a periodicity of maybe every hour or so, you're communicating information to those downstream counties. So let's go over some, at least some broad findings initially from the test bed. One of the first things that we discovered was that the Central Region RMA was extremely useful during this test bed period. I noted here that it's more useful than an SPC, and that's certainly not a knock against SPC, any particular item or so. It's just a recognition of that the Central Region RMA was specifically useful for these testbed offices. SPC was not specifically tasked with any role within this testbed, so it's a little unfair to expect enhanced services or anything like that specific to this testbed group of offices. So they've got an entire country to issue products for, and the Central Region RMA was able to focus their attention on the specific areas within the testbed offices. So that was extremely useful. Offices did note that workload issues were a problem at times with these added tasks being used during convective events. So ultimately, they found that prioritizing the easiest communication methods were useful. So we'll go over that in a little bit more detail. But ultimately, NWS chat was found to be probably the most effective method of easily communicating that information to partners. And then they also found that investigating redundant tasks or centralizing those things were particularly useful. So one example of that may be to find maybe 3 or 4 graphics that were particularly useful and could be used over and over in different situations, and then finding methods to quickly populate those graphics to easily send out that communication. The watch warning type communications were useful beyond the watch warnings gap specifically. So what I mean by that is, a lot of times the watch, we dealt with kind of nebulous situations where the convective mode or the initiation was uncertain. So maybe a watch didn't come out, with a large lead time, or instances where maybe there were a few warnings that were issued before the watch was issued. So that communication method wasn't specific to that period between the watch and warning. It was ultimately useful throughout the event, whether that would be before the watch or if a watch was not issued at all. So we found that those communication methods were strategically important and useful at any time. And then the partners ultimately appreciated the info regardless. So, a piece of feedback that we found is any and all of that information was beneficial to the partners, and they certainly appreciated it. So these were the 5 tactics or so that were recommended to be explored, and then each one had particular findings associated with them. So specific to NWS chat, every office again utilized that successfully and found benefit communicating information to our partners through that medium. There were overwhelmingly positive feedback from partners, as I mentioned earlier. And so the recommendation would be to prioritize NWS chat if workload becomes an issue. And things are very busy. You should still prioritize NWS chat above any other communication method, if at all possible. Now we know there are certainly some technical issues associated with NWS chat, so having backup methods such as Google chat rooms can also be beneficial. The AFD Meso updates was another one that was recommended to test out, and we did. We did find that it was useful to communicate details in the forecast within these AFD Meso updates, but they tended to be time-consuming and not particularly widely used by partners. They were used by some, but not especially widely used. So we recommend that if you're using a Meso AFD, that focus that information on the timing prior to convective initiation, and then probably transition to other means of communications that can be more easily communicated without a lot of legwork to go into that. The social media graphics that were provided, we did provide a group of social media templates to all offices to use. Those tended to be a lot, we found out. So one recommendation would be to maybe have a better organization scheme to those graphics, and then maybe whittle those down to a handful of templates that can be easily populated, and then refreshed every couple of years to facilitate kind of a new look and feel to those graphics to be used. And then finally, open webinars and social media live streaming. We did find that open webinars were, again, extremely useful. This is not a new finding, certainly. The Weather Service has employed this technology for a number of years. This continues to be an effective communication for our partners, since it gives them the opportunity for that two-way communication. They can ask questions directly to our forecasters. Specific to live streaming, some forecasters were a little uncomfortable with live streaming, so we may have to find some subject matter experts within each office that are comfortable with that medium if we want to successfully implement that strategy. And then there were some concerns from our media partners on whether live streaming was appropriate within their area, and whether that infringes kind of on that private partner public private partnership that we have established. So if you do want to explore live streaming, I think it's important to have that communication with your partners, with your media partners, and kind of hash out what's appropriate and what's not within your area. So I'll wrap up by saying the full report is available on the Central Region ISD Google site. There's a direct link there, but you can certainly find it on the Google site if you want to dive into more details on the test bed. So that's all I have, Ali and Randy, and I'll certainly take any questions.